going on at home. Thank you. Just the ladies just told us we're recording. Thank you, lady. Yeah, we really appreciated that people's time is precious, and thank you so much for joining us. And look, today we're talking about domestic violence, and we recognise that that is a very difficult subject for many people. So just be kind to yourselves. We're here to help, and we're here to unpack a few things. And these talks are just so important because this is still such a major problem that even though you'll meet some incredible women today who are working in this sector, there are some voices at the top that just aren't hearing what we need in this area. So that's quite frustrating. But the woman that brings us all here together today is Yvonne Weldon. She's the first ever, can you believe it? I can't, it's disgusting. She's the first ever Aboriginal Australian to stand for Lord Mayor in the 179-year history of the City of Sydney Council. She's a proud Wiradjuri woman and a strong community leader. And we've met many times, Yvonne, on different occasions at different gigs. We've got to know each other a little bit. And I know that today you'd like to start off with a welcome to country and a minute's silence as well.
Thank you. Now, just a little warning for everyone. I have my 2-year-old grandson here, so if you hear something else in the background, that would be Thailand. And I also have a couple of animals here as well, and they snore when they doze off, so it's not me. So can we not play the guitar? Thank you.
Yeah, no, not guitar.
Not the guitar.
This is the world. This is the world we live in, isn't it, Yvonne? I mean, this is the thing. People are juggling things. Mums and dads at home figuring it out. It's tough stuff.
It is. So, hello, everyone. Firstly, I would like to thank the speakers and the advocates for being the voice of so many women and children for living this heartache in the public eye. You have put the spotlight on the difficulties that is lived by so many, but rarely listened to. Not just for the women and the children, but for the men struggling also, particularly our young men damaged by this cycle. My name is Yvonne Weldon, and I'm a Wiradjuri woman from Cowra, here in New South Wales. I'm from the waters of the Clare, which later became known as the Lachlan, and of the Murrumbidgee rivers. I am the Deputy Chairperson of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, who are the cultural authority under the Aboriginal Land Rights Act for the land we're meeting on. I'd like to pay my respects, sorry.
Oh, that's good. See, just a cheeky mute. I like a little cheeky mute during your welcome. That's great. When you mute yourself back on, she's back.
I would like to pay my respects to all elders, past and present, to all First Nations, to you, and the many nations of lands that you're on today. The boundaries of our traditional owners are not defined by the hand and by the pen, but through the natural landscapes of the earth. The Eora Nations country covers the Hawkes River in the north, the Nepean in the west, and the Georges River in the south. My people have practiced our traditions for thousands of years and endless generations. One tradition that is shared in various forms across Australia is a welcome to country. As you travel across this beautiful continent of ours, understanding and entering the lands of nations, tribes, and clans that have existed here for over 60,000 years. The First Nations of this country are the oldest living culture of the world, and our practices and our traditions have sustained us, and they are embedded into the core of this nation. On behalf of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, the elders, and the members, I welcome everyone to the land of the Gadigal. I acknowledge the Gadigal people and the people's lands that you're on, whose spirits and ancestors will always remain with these lands, our Mother Earth. As we're gathered here today, we need to recognise and acknowledge that violence should not be a part of our nature, but for so many, it has become a way of life. The behaviours sometimes aren't known until after the impact, but this doesn't mean that we can't support and create a change in a cycle, a change for the children, a change for the women, a change for the men, a change for the families. And in 2018, the NAIDOC theme was Because of Her We Can. I've been blessed to be guided and taught by many incredible Wiradjuri women. It's important to acknowledge the women that give so much of themselves for all of us, not just for each other. And you should acknowledge this as we go through our times of what we are suffering at the moment. The women give endlessly because they believe in you, and it is important to honour them. And to give recognition of the never-ending dedication of women, could you all please pause for a moment to remember the many sacrifices that women have made along the way, the ones we will continue to make, and those that should never happen. As you connect, learn and share today, tomorrow and beyond, we can all make a difference today and every day. So don't let violence in all its forms to continue. The silence enables those to continue to take what is not theirs at the expense of all of us. Don't stay silent. Don't turn away. Don't just speak the words or make changes through policy or legislation. Be the change. Hear the women. Listen to the children. Invest in the families to invest in all of us. Prevent the future of heartache, bringing the healing to the past and to the now. And with your voice, the courage and our joint action, then and only then, you can bring a healing for each and every one of us, from one generation to the next. So don't live regretting what we should have done, but create the legacy of what must be done. We need to make real changes and not just symbolic ones, working in equal partnerships. Together, all women, along with the committed men that support and encourage, can bring about positive change now and into the future. To make that future possible, let us all draw upon my people's spirits as we continue on our journey. May my people's spirits walk with you and guide you as we strive forward for us all. Again, on behalf of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, welcome to Gadigal land. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And as I've concluded the welcome to country, could you all please pause for a moment to think about, let's pause for an actual minute to recognise the many lives that have been lost, not just this year, but every year that has passed. And let's think about what we don't want to continue in the years to come.
Thank you, Yvonne, for welcome to country. And yeah, it's a very important thing to sit with those thoughts, because they're never far away for friends and family that we know, and also many women that we don't know, where these statistics are hideous. 35 women already have been killed from violence in 2021. Every 2 minutes, the police get a call involving a domestic violence incident, and 85% of women have been sexually harassed in Australia, and more than 1 million children have experienced domestic violence, which is a really unacceptable number. I'm always so moved listening to you speak, Yvonne, and thank you again for organising this and bringing it together. And as I said earlier, we've got some incredible women working in this space joining us today. My name's Julia Zemiro. I'll be your host. I'm a television presenter, and I'm also an ambassador for Our Watch, which is a national organisation and a leader in primary prevention of violence against women and their children in Victoria. Joining us also, and give us a little wave so we know, Delia Donovan, a little wave from Delia. Delia is the CEO of Domestic Violence in New South Wales. She has 21 years experience in social work and social care settings, spending the last 11 years in the domestic and family violence sector. Jessica Shulman, she might do a bit of a wave as well, is a senior solicitor at the Immigration Advice and Rights Centre, a not-for-profit specialist community legal centre. She's primarily focused on the intersection between domestic family violence and immigration law. Tali Starr is there as well. Tali is a singer-songwriter, close to my heart, speaker and consultant with particular interests in domestic family violence and how it intersects with homelessness and disabilities, with a special interest in trauma, focus, healing and training. She also works with peak bodies, NGOs, government services and lived expertise groups. And Yvonne, of course, our first ever Aboriginal Australian to stand for Lord Mayor, and also, as she said, Deputy Chairwoman of the New South Wales Australia Day Council and the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council. And she also sits on the board of Domestic Violence New South Wales and Redfern Jardim College. I thought I'd begin by asking each of our speakers today, just for about 5 minutes, to explain what they do and in their jobs, because they're all quite different. And we're here to look at how local government and communities can come together. So Delia, I might start with you.
Thanks, Julia. I'm just going to quickly grab my notes up. So good to see everyone and a few familiar faces, which is always lovely. So thanks everyone. I'm Delia Donovan. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners too of the land that I meet you on. I'm on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So I'm Delia Donovan, as you know. I'm the CEO of Domestic Violence New South Wales, a role I take really seriously, and I'm really proud to lead this organisation. I started my career working with children and young people who were unable to live with their families and have a social work background. And I started that work in 1999, and I'm still 20 years old, FYI. I actually took this experience of social work and working with children into a domestic violence charity that's been running since 1976 and set up the first of its kind children's services response in 2009, making sure that we could not just only have refuge support services, advocacy services and helplines and everything else we were doing in that organisation, but ensure we could respond to the needs of children and young people across those areas and in those services. So I did that work from 2009, and that's when I came into the domestic violence sector, and again became CEO of that organisation, which was fantastic back in the UK. Then came over to Australia and really got amongst it in the community space, working at White Ribbon and really thinking about that prevention lens and how you engage men in this conversation, which I think is so important, and ensuring we bring about accountability but don't necessarily isolate, and how we just bring everyone into this solution, because this is a solution, this can be solved, but as Julia and Yvonne have already mentioned, it's going to take commitment, listening, learning and growing together, and commitment in terms of funding as well. You know, we really need to look at the baseline of the funding across the sector, which I'll speak to later. So Domestic Violence New South Wales, I've been working with Domestic Violence New South Wales since June 2020, and it does feel like 5 years. But like I said, a role I take really seriously. We represent 125 specialist domestic and family violence organisations across the state. Our membership includes refuges, counselling services, women's health centres, legal services, specialist multicultural organisations, Aboriginal controlled organisations, women's domestic violence court advocacy services, survivors, and many, many more on the front lines. Our vision is for a future where women, families, and communities can live free from violence, and all of our work contributes to that goal. We provide a representative voice, and again, I really heard that, Yvonne, voice is so important, and advocacy function for these services. So it's so important we're advocating for these frontline organisations that frankly aren't funded well enough, and there's not enough of them. Our mission is to eliminate domestic and family violence through leadership in policy, advocacy, partnerships, and the promotion of best practice. And everything we do is about collaboration, and we would be nothing without the membership base who provide the evidence for us. So we're constantly getting information from our members to ensure we can inform the government about things they need to do, and also councils about what councils need, e.g. the City of Sydney. We need to look at housing and refuges, and again, we'll talk about that more later. But yes, so really great to be here, and looking forward to the conversation today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Delia. And yes, I should also acknowledge that I'm recording my part of this interview today on Gundungurra and Dharawal land, and I pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. Over to you, Jessica.
Hello, everyone. I also want to acknowledge first that I'm speaking to you from beautiful Darug and Gundungurra country, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and future. My name is Jessica Shulman. I'm a senior solicitor at the Immigration Advice and Rights Centre, also known as IARC. We're a community legal centre based in Sydney. We've been around for about 30 years. We provide free legal advice and assistance in migration, refugee and citizenship law. Our services include legal advice, providing casework, community legal education, and law reform and advocacy. Around 50% of the work that we do and the clients we see are women on temporary visas who experienced or have experienced domestic and family violence. Last year, we delivered more than 1,000 legal services to clients experiencing or at risk of domestic and family violence. And we're quite a small team, so that's quite a serious number there. We work really closely with many domestic and family violence specialist services across Sydney and New South Wales to provide expert support and legal advice and assistance to women on temporary visas who experience DV. As the Domestic and Family Violence Specialist Solicitor at IARC, my focus is the intersection of immigration law and domestic and family violence. I'm really passionate about bringing to light the inequalities within our domestic and family violence and immigration systems that result in women being unable to access safety and support when they need it the most. In my line of work, I see clients every day who've experienced domestic and family violence, where that domestic and family violence in some way has affected their visa status. Many of these women are primary carers of Australian children. Many of these women have upended their lives in their home country to settle in Australia with their families. And for women on temporary visas, domestic and family violence can actually look really different than domestic and family violence experienced by Australian women. Every story is different, but almost every woman I assist has experienced what we term as immigration-related abuse, which is a category of coercive and controlling behaviour. This violence is often perpetrated by their Australian partners, and it includes things like threats to cancel a visa or threats to have a woman deported or to separate them from their children. These kinds of tactics, these threats are common tactics used by abusive partners to exploit and control women on temporary visas and prevent the reporting of abuse, as well as serves to establish a fear of the police and the legal system. And we're not talking small numbers of women here either. Monash University recently conducted a national study in partnership with Harmony Alliance, focusing on migrant and refugee women's safety and security in Australia. Now, they surveyed over 1,000 women and they found that 33% of migrant women have experienced domestic and family violence, with women on temporary visas reporting proportionately higher levels of DV than Australian women. We all know women who experience DV face considerable barriers reporting domestic and family violence and accessing safety and justice. I don't think that that's news to anyone. Women on temporary visas face additional complex barriers to safety because they often have unique vulnerabilities, things like language barriers that may mean women are unable to access information that could assist them to make choices. Women may come from countries where police are actually not agents of protection and they fear contacting the police as a result. There may be differences in the definition of family violence between their home country and Australia. There may be pressure from family and the community to keep family violence private, and there may be a fear of bringing shame to the family if it's reported. In addition to this, services supporting women experiencing domestic and family violence are often at capacity and under-resourced, and this can also affect a woman's decision to report. In addition to this, the system is unfortunately set up in such a way that in addition to navigating a complex and scary immigration system often set against them, women on temporary visas are often unable to access Centrelink, childcare subsidies, Medicare or housing. And the denial of these access to these services can sometimes be the reason behind why women choose to stay in an abusive relationship rather than become homeless, destitute, and worry that their children are going to be taken away from them. So a lot of the issues facing women on temporary visas are issues that need to be changed on a federal level. But I really believe it's important to raise these issues on every level because the consequences of DV are really local. They're personal to all of us because suffering affects us all, both individually and as a community at large. So I'm really looking forward to discussing how the City of Sydney can provide support and resources to all women, no matter their migration status or where they've come from, who need safety from DV.
Thank you. We'll also be opening up for questions in about half an hour or so, 40 minutes. So if you've got some questions that you'd like to ask throughout listening to this, please put them in the chat. Over to you, Tali.
Thanks, Julia. And I want to acknowledge the land that I'm meeting you on, and it's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. My words are all getting mixed up at the moment. I apologise. And I just want to thank them for the use of this land. And I've got a slightly different thing that I do in my work. I work as a consultant, so I don't have one particular area that I work with. I work with different groups, different peak bodies. I engage with basically whatever comes across my path at the time, which makes it a very interesting and exciting job because I don't know what tomorrow will bring. And some days I get up thinking, oh, today's a quiet day and I haven't stopped it till 7 p.m. at the end of the evening. I trained as a musician and a singer, and I worked professionally for a number of years. And then I used to teach singing, and I also did a counselling course, and I found those things work together to almost provide a music therapy kind of focus. And when I did my singing, I was working on building people's internal dialogues. So it's kind of a natural flow to then work in the area of DV, which is about empowering women and other people to be able to speak up and to claim their voice and to be able to communicate what happened to them to other people. I myself have also had an experience of domestic and family violence, both in my family and an ex-partner, and I can bring that experience into what I do. So I work with different groups with policies, trying to really create effective and dynamic policies that work with people to create the safest way forwards for people, to empower people. I try and work with governments and other organisations to understand trauma and how it affects us, and to create policies and ways forward that will help those systems not be so traumatising. And the problem at the moment is that they are. They don't wish to change that, and there's a real reluctance to do that. Small pockets do, but we need this kind of idea where we all understand the change needs to happen, both in community, local government, state government, and federal government. And we need to have that idea that these things can be changed, and they can be changed because we work as a collective to do it. And we already saw with the marches, Enough is Enough, when a whole group of people start to stand up, people start to listen. And so I want to encourage us as a community to really champion this cause to change domestic and family violence and the fact that it continues to happen, and to reframe the way that we think about it, and to take the focus off what is she doing to get out of it to what is he doing? What is his behaviour? This is not okay. This is not acceptable. He needs to be held account. So we're going to talk about a lot more around all of this later, but I think the more that we can understand that it's a whole of society problem, it's a whole of society change, the more we're actually going to be able to facilitate change. And I love just having a small part in all of this. We've got amazing women on this panel. There are incredible people who do so much work in this space. And if we can get alongside them, if we can stop being bystanders and we can start saying, hey, this is not okay, which I know we're just starting to do, but we still don't believe women are telling the truth. And the statistics are coming out. I think it's over 50% of people still think that women are making this up. And I think you don't make up something like this because you risk losing everything. So I want to just leave you on a slight downer note, but we will go up as we have this conversation and think about how can we make this better and how can we work as a whole society to change this. Thank you.
Thank you. I hosted the march, the Women's March, the one in Canberra this year. And I really believe there were many, many men and women and men marching there that year who have never marched before. And I really felt that something was happening. We had lots of talks afterwards, as you can imagine, but the Women's Safety Summit that happened not long ago was so disappointing in so many ways. And the other thing, of course, that's happened in the last 18 months is COVID, and that the impact will have been huge on domestic violence. Delia, do you want to speak a bit to the service experiences during COVID-19, what you found?
Yeah, and echoing, Julia, what you said about the Women's Safety Summit, I wanted to speak a bit about that today and try and put a positive.
Let's talk about that.
Yeah, we'll talk about that
waste
too.
of time. Yeah,
definitely. And the thing is, for us, it's about making sure we can advocate and keep banging that drum, because I'm telling you, the service space, we're screaming loudly. We know what we need. But yeah, that Women's Safety Summit was a bit of a disappointment based on the fact, yes, COVID is a thing. It ended up getting postponed and then it went online. And I think if you were in the tent and you were consulted, and actually there were so many important communities left out of the conversation. So I still see so much work that needs to be done on that, and I will speak to that as well today. And we did an opinion piece, which I'll throw in the chat box at some point too. And I think what's going to be really important for the City of Sydney is a couple of things where we think about COVID. I think if we are fortunate enough to feel that, you know, we're now recovering from COVID and we're moving through, what I work in is not the case. The services are actually really, really struggling at the moment, and the recovery period is almost a scary word, because as New South Wales opens up, our services are going to be maxed out in terms of referrals, and they're not well funded enough. And I want to also mention another thing. We keep calling domestic and family violence the shadow pandemic next to COVID-19. If you work in this space, there's nothing shadow pandemic about domestic and family violence. So Domestic Violence New South Wales, where I work, we surveyed our members and 78 of them responded, which was really important for us because we wanted to see what was happening in lockdown. So 6 weeks into lockdown, which would have been about mid-July, maybe the end of July, this is what our members told us. And this is just 6 weeks in, so we know this would have got worse. But 73% of our services told us that they'd seen an increase in demand to their services in those 6 weeks. Now, concerningly, 15 services told us that they'd seen a decrease in demand. Now, that in itself tells you that victim survivors are struggling to access help because they're stuck with the perpetrator. So that's been happening for a long, long time if we think about lockdown starting on the 25th of June. What our services also told us is they saw an 84% increase to the complexity of the referrals coming in. And by the complexity, I'm going to speak very briefly, and Jessica's very passionate about this space, but people on temporary visas, we had to fight hard with the government to ensure they were not on the streets during COVID. So people on temporary visas have got a lack of a housing pathway, a lot of lack of support, funds and everything else. And yes, like Jessica's mentioned, it's a federal government issue and it's also a New South Wales government issue because it tends to get bounced around, and we're saying, gosh, we need to make sure we've got the right health support for these cohorts. We need to make sure they can get refuge and housing. But I mean, at the moment, the government have put a lot of people on temporary visas in emergency accommodation, but that will end in January. So again, we're really working ferociously with government to say, what's the safe exit plan? Now, some of the other complexities in this 84% increase includes financial stress and pressure. And as I mentioned, a lack of a housing pathway. I know right now, 1,800 people in temporary accommodation are being exited. Where are they going to go in the City of Sydney and elsewhere in New South Wales? Onto the streets? And that's another thing we're having to work ferociously with the government on. So there's some horror stories out there, and they are actually happening. And there's some wonderful advocates, like Tali said, doing some work. We're really, really trying. But the lack of housing in our state and in in City of Sydney is an issue. And in COVID, these issues were exacerbated. Our services also told us about staff burnout and turnover. Now, we want to really keep the amazing workforce doing what they do. And some people have worked in this space longer than me and long into it, but we're losing a really good experienced workforce because of what's happening in COVID. People are tired and burned out. Waiting lists have increased. We've also seen a fact that, and we work with the government on this, that our frontline domestic and family violence workers weren't able to access vaccinations. Now that's also really unsafe and something we had to work on. And because I guess there's been inadequate funding already for domestic and family violence services, it's been an issue that we didn't get the COVID emergency funding out quick enough. And I know now that's coming in a few weeks, but gosh, we went into lockdown on the 25th of June. So services are desperate to get some funding to ensure they can help their clients. Children and young people, we know that the child protection reporting went down in COVID. Now that in itself is also very, very concerning, because I guess children are not being seen during this pandemic. And that's something we're working on with the government again around. We need to educate, again, the community around the issues for children. And we need to ensure there's specialist workers in domestic violence services supporting children. Often if you work with adults, you don't have a specialism in children. And I learned that having a children's background coming into the adult space in 2009. So it's really important we've got a variety of services in domestic and family violence space. And if there was already existing housing issues in COVID, as we know there were, COVID again exacerbated that. So we've had some real issues, like I said, with a lack of social housing in the city of Sydney and in the state. We also had some really horrific reports on policing. Now we know there's been some positive policing and some really great stories, but there's also been some racist policing taking place in COVID and those areas where the lockdown was really enforced. I've heard stories of a mother picking up her child, the mask falling down and her being fined. Now these LGAs are already suffering financial issues based on the lockdown. So we've had to work really closely with New South Wales Police during this period as well. And again, I mean, like I said, a few problems and issues which we've had to address very quickly. And really what's been happening from a peak level, I think we're all very, very tired at DV New South Wales because all our meetings are kind of tripled, but just making sure government across the issues and members are telling us straight what's happening. We're going straight to the police, we're going straight to the government, straight to the Attorney General, which is great that we can do that as a peak. But those marginalised communities, those communities in poverty have really, really suffered. And post-lockdown, we're going to see some serious issues. Referrals are going to go up. The funding hasn't gone out quick enough. A lack of a housing pathway. Now, I sound doom and gloom, but know that, again, we're advocating on these issues with government, that there's some big, big issues if you're struggling in a COVID situation. So that's kind of what we found during COVID so far. And obviously those issues aren't going anywhere. And we need to continue to work really tightly on the recovery, which doesn't feel like recovery for a lot of people that are kind of
Delia, if you could remove one barrier, what would it be? Like in a scenario, what would it be? Would it be that there's more women in Parliament that are actually have a lived experience or know about it, are starting to say something and actually moving something forward? Because there's a lot of men in suits there who I just don't think get it. They just don't get it. And while they're in charge in that way, they don't hear it. They just don't hear it.
Hell yes, Julia. And I must admit, I'm so amazed by the sector because I think when people are tired and exhausted, they don't stop advocating because we have to keep banging the drum to the same politicians. Now, we have an engaged Attorney General, which is great. And I'm seeing some positive changes, not enough quickly enough, but we definitely need women in more roles. We absolutely do. And we need to stop hearing excuses about, look how much money is being made at the moment in housing and the stamp duty. And we can't get women safely into safe houses and refuges and into housing pathways. That's just not acceptable at all. So there needs to be much more of a commitment to funding, and there needs to be a change in attitudes in the community, and particularly at a government level. We're conditioned by what we read, see and hear. And we've got a government that's very kind of, dare I say, white, male, older, and we need to really get a bit of diversity mixed up in the space. And that's when change is going to happen, when there's a diversity of views and thoughts and experiences.
How lucky there's an election coming up. Anyway, Jessica, I know for you would like to see also better training and education for police in how they protect women on temporary visas. I mean, Delia's just mentioned that there's been a real kind of racist take on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, generally, by the time our clients come to our service, they've already had an interaction or several interactions with the police. And in many instances, that interaction has not resulted in a protective outcome. It hasn't resulted in an AVO being taken out or any consequences for the perpetrator. There's often a focus by the police on physical violence over other kinds of violence. And it's not uncommon for some of our clients to be viewed with suspicion, as though they have a motive for claiming they've experienced family violence other than seeking safety. Their visa status it can sometimes be used as a measure of credibility, and their experience questioned on the suspicion they might be just trying to get permanent residency. But I agree with Tali. People don't make up these stories. They've got a lot more to lose. They'll lose they lose everything when they make a claim of family violence. So yeah, it is quite concerning. There's also, unfortunately, there's a lot of cultural bias and racism that women on temporary visas do experience, from the police and the judiciary system. For example, the latest report from the New South Wales DV Death Review Team, and they raised the issues specifically with the policing of culturally and linguistically diverse women, things like failing to use an interpreter, doubting or minimising a victim's experience of violence, and making culturally insensitive comments. And in some of these circumstances, due to these issues, the police mistakenly identify the victim as the perpetrator, despite the perpetrator being known to the police. This isn't an experience that's unique to culturally and linguistically diverse women, because we know that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women are regularly misidentified as the perpetrators of violence at very, very high rates. Another major issue we see is regularly is police not using professional interpreters when speaking to victim survivors of DV. In fact, 57% of services surveyed by Women's Safety New South Wales indicated that their clients had been pressured not to engage an interpreter service when dealing with the police. That's huge. We hear situations where the police don't use professional interpreters. Sometimes they'll use the perpetrator or a family member of the perpetrator, as an interpreter for the victim. It's unacceptable. I mean, it's simply impossible to ascertain the facts from a victim's perspective when they're not provided with a safe and appropriate way to communicate with the police. So I think this is a huge systemic problem, and it really places these women at risk of further violence and possibly even death. It also leads to women not wanting to report in the future. And honestly, why would you, when, the message that these women are receiving is that your story is not really that important to be listened to. So I'd like to see better training and education for the police in serving and protecting women, and particularly women from diverse backgrounds, culturally and linguistically diverse women. And also in particular where it's non-physical domestic violence that's being observed, like coercive controlling behaviour. And, this is really in line with some of the recommendations that were made in the New South Wales Parliament report on coercive control in domestic relationships, which was released, I think, in June this year, just before we went into COVID lockdown.
Thank you. Talia, what about you? Do you want to talk about the failures around housing and supports there, and how this could be made better if we actually focused around, the person, a more person-centered approach?
Yeah, I just want to pick up a couple of points that were
Please.
And I think they'll all kind of blend together, but I think the whole thing about not taking people seriously, not getting proper interpreters, not getting police that are engaging in the right way, I think that comes back to what I was saying earlier about I think a lot of what we experience is because of the patriarchy that we have lifted up rather than the equality that we experience. And I think that's one of the fundamental problems, because we have men coming in who've already got an attitude that women are not equal to them. Women are not saying the truth. And there are definitely men who do not do that, but there are so many that do. So immediately, every time you're trying to engage with any system, whether it's police, whether it's housing, whether it's government, whether it's, courts, whatever it is, even local government, you have that framework that you're walking into. So immediately, as a woman or a woman who is from a different background, you're already starting way behind. And I think that immediately can be changed just by local government can just start it with everyone is equal and changing within their cultures. And I'm on a reference group for a council that is actually doing that, and it's changing it from the inside out and taking it very seriously. And I think when we do that, we start to shake up things because we don't allow what's always been acceptable to continue. And I think we're starting, you know, women are really starting that, and we've talked about the marches. I've never been to a march before because I've got disabilities, but I chose to push myself to go to that march because I really am saying enough is enough. And I think when we engage with housing and culture, housing and systems, that's exactly what we need to be saying. Enough is enough, because for too long, these systems have been allowed to continue by saying, I'm going to continue as a perpetrator. We're a power and control structure. You will listen to me. You will do what I say. If you're not doing what I say, then you are doing something wrong. We set up these systems with punitive attitudes that you're rorting the system. We don't let people actually get out of the system because we've got them so entrenched in, if you earn a tiny bit of money, then we'll take that money away. If you save a bit of money, we'll take that saving away. And then if you go and you need housing, well, why can't you afford housing? Or why can't you just go and get a job? Or we don't give enough money for people on Centrelink. There's just so many facets to it. And I think the other thing which Delia also alluded to is this silos thing that happens. It happens in every government organisation from state all the way through to federal. No, it's not our department, it's so-and-so's department. No, it's not our section, it's this person's section. I don't want to tread on the DV minister's toes because that's his area, even though it crosses into housing and it crosses into... You don't go, okay, I'm experiencing DV. Here's the DV over here. Here's my homelessness situation over here. Here's my disability over here. It doesn't work like that. They all are happening at the same time, and they all have to be addressed at the same time. And rather than having this attitude of just go somewhere else, go somewhere else, go somewhere else, let's have a government that goes, hey, yeah, this is really important. Let's take all of these intersecting issues and bring them together so that we can actually frame this. Like, we say we care about ending domestic and family violence. We say we care about women being safe. We say we want to end sexual violence towards all people and women. But the thing is, our attitudes are not showing that. Our behaviour is not showing that. Our funding is not showing that. Our policies are not showing that. Our way we treat each other is not showing that. And whilst we're making little inroads, a lot of it is coming from women and some sympathetic men, rather than a whole of us saying enough is enough.
Yvonne, for you, why did you want to call this today? What are you seeing in your kind of run at Lord Mayor in this space?
Oh, look, you know, like, I think that there's so much more that needs to be done. Certainly the way that we look at the city, you know, it's always about the glitz and the high end of town, but there's so much more that needs to be represented, but certainly needs to be voiced. When we look at the accesses to services and programs, it's not about how we live. It's more about, you know, what we can see in glossy magazines or, you know, the promo materials, but the reality of you know, people's lives, particularly women and children, is being marginalised more and more each day. You know, we see great, you know, looking developments that are being put up, you know, pretty much overnight, and yet there's supposedly planning processes in place, and yet we don't think about the very people that it impacts. You know, affordable and social housing is desperately needed, but there's also situations where we have our women and children and our families that have been experienced, you know, have experienced domestic violence and family violence in ways that are, you know, not talked about, and it's certainly not been represented. And what I would like to see, that there needs to be so much more in our city, and our City of Sydney Council is not actually doing that. They have done it more so now because we're going into an election period, but there's this need has always been there. COVID is certainly putting a spotlight on it because there's been an increase, and certainly there's you know, there's a clearer divide with the very people that are continually impacted by the fact that our resources that we do have supposedly locally is not being represented for the very people that need to live in it or need to escape it. So, you know, I would like to see that there has to be so many more access to services and programs, but also to safe places. And if we don't have a refuge within the LGA, why are we not, you know, through the planning processes and certainly through the levies that supposedly these developments are putting into our community? I mean, it's putting into council and councilmen are putting it into our community. Why do we not have safe homes in all of these, you know, new developments, these housing that's been, you know, that's been built and built, you know, and sold at such astronomical rates, but the very people that need to escape you know, violence need to have somewhere safe to go. And I truly feel that, you know, how can we have such a beautiful city with so many accesses to services or existing services, but yet we're not actually creating the linkages, and we have an obligation to create that link.
We've got some questions coming in, and so maybe I'll open that up and the panel can use anything that they've got in their own information. But this is a question from Olivia. I hope it's okay to say your name. She says, I see so much justified mistrust and anger towards police and people responding to DFV. How do we work on the police DFV response through training, making it more trauma-informed or non-uniform police, intensifying training, encouraging police discretion and training around systemic racism and ripple effects? I mean, I think this is all great stuff, Olivia. You should be in charge because that seems such a great obvious thing to be doing. How can we go about legislative reform around AVO? Because often it's too late for these incidents. They'll take place, you know, anyway. Who would like to answer that? Delia. Yes, putting a hand up like a great student.
Jump in. But I'm sure my wonderful panelists will want to add.
I'm sure.
I mean, we get to meet the Assistant Commissioner, Leanne McCusker, monthly now, just to share some of the issues. And we're definitely getting our members to escalate anything that happens and then actually having them investigate concerns from the community. But what I do think will work, I said this to the police, we meet with the New South Wales Police regularly, like I said, not just Leanne McCusker, but how are they recruiting police? Because often what's happening is you've got quite young, I mean, it's great to have diversity again in terms of gender, but it tends to possibly be younger males that are maybe 18, 19, 20. I went into social work really young. And you're walking into houses, we heard the stat, every 2 minutes, a call is about domestic and family violence. And you're walking into a house where the abuse is probably 40 years old and you're 18 years old. So we have got an issue around the training, which we're talking to the New South Wales Police about, and we've asked to observe the induction training. And we've asked that it's not just induction tick box, it's domestic and family violence training throughout the year, and it's trauma informed. Now, we also know positively, I mentioned Women's Domestic Violence Court Advocacy Services, what a mouthful, WDV CASs. They do incredible work. There's 27 of them across the state. Now, 6 of them are piloting in police stations, working in the police station. Now, that's a model that's going to be so successful. We haven't seen the outcomes yet, but I guarantee, and from working in the UK at Dash, I didn't mention Domestic Abuse Stops Here, where I was CEO back in the UK. We work so closely with the police, and we sometimes based ourselves at the police station. If you've got services working really closely with the police, that's going to be a great outcome. If you've got more women police officers and you're training police officers better, and not to say I'm not trying to be doom and gloom on male officers, there's some really great responses going on out there, but there's a lot of work to be done. There's a police audit coming out, and I think it's going to be damning, but I do think it's an opportunity to see some key recommendations and change. So that's a bit about some of the things I know that are happening at the moment. And I mean, we do have a good relationship, like I said, with the Assistant Commissioner. More needs to be done, but we're not going to. We also met Minister Elliott, the Police Minister as well, went really hard on him about the interpreter stuff, Jessica, and everything else. So I guess it's a case of.
And do they hear you when you talk to them? Like, and I'm not having a go at anyone, but you know, when you have those conversations, I mean, do they go dead in the eyes, or are they actually listening? Is the light on? You know.
Am I allowed to be honest or not? No, I will be. I like Shenna as well.
Take your pick,
laughing
Julia.
faces. I think we have to hold them accountable, and sometimes I am worried by the response, because I think, do you actually get it? But what's really important about peak bodies and advocates is they don't stop. So we don't just have that meeting and go bye bye, see you soon. We follow up with that team. We ask for accountability, we ask for reports, we ask to see what's happening. And the fact we're getting a regular dialogue is important. But I'm with you, Julia, sometimes I do think it's not translating very well, and it's not processed very well, because I guess some of the lived experience and lived expertise and working in services isn't happening sometimes at that policy level, and practice and theory have to work well together. And I don't sometimes think that that's processed too well. But I do think there'll be more initiatives where women's services are engaged with New South Wales Police. And I think someone just mentioned in the chat box about the police procedures and policies. Now, what we've also found is they've been quite hidden, and we've asked them to be put out in the, like, what have you got to hide? Start showing us your policies and procedures, start showing us what you're doing, and then you won't get the big Hayley Gleason piece in the ABC. So yes, there's some issues with the fact they do have some of these policies and procedures, but they're not always accountable to them. And they often ask for, like, the incident where we've given them information. We need the event ID number, and we're saying, look, this is an issue, but we'll get it for you. So sometimes there's a bit of legwork to keep them accountable. But yeah, there's definitely some key things that I think will be happening following that police audit, which I think is going to be in the coming month, and there'll be a huge amount of, I would say, damning media. So there'll need to be action.
Another question here, the family law system from Petra. Thank you, Petra. The family law system is rife with gender double standards, particularly in terms of the complete lack of accountability by the offending parent. Perpetrator parenting is frequently overlooked, and the mother's parenting is over-pathologised and scrutinised. How can our sector have an impact and affect real change in what is essentially an antiquated court system based on patriarchal cultural norms that put the father's rights first and not the child? And I would say too that that antiquated system is in Parliament itself, in that Westminster system, where all they do is yell at one another and no one talks to each other. Who would like to talk about that? Jessica?
Look, unfortunately, I mean, I don't work in the family law system. I really specialise in immigration law. What I do, the relevant to what I see on a day-to-day is women on temporary visas who have experienced domestic violence, who have Australian children, the relationship, and they're the primary carer of the kids, and where the children are on an airport watch list and they're unable to travel with mum, and they're going through the court system, and sometimes through the criminal system, and mum has no real visa pathway to remain in Australia long-term or permanently. And this is an incredibly, we see this every day. It's a really difficult, distressing set of circumstances, because mum and the kids have different visa statuses. The kids are citizens, and mum may not be able to remain here, you know, for more than a very limited amount of time. And what does that do to the family unit? So these are the sorts of things we see, and the things that we advocate for on a federal level. And we actually have, we're involved in a national advocacy group for women on temporary visas. And we work collaboratively with 50 or so national and state-based organisations to develop a blueprint for reform, with the goals to removing barriers for to safety for victim survivors of DV who are on temporary visas. And one of the things that we are really advocating for, and as Delia said, banging that drum, is a visa pathway for women who are on temporary visas, who are responsible for Australian children, where those children cannot travel overseas, and giving them access to support, Centrelink, housing, you know, all those sorts of things that enable someone to have just to be able to live in Australia and to raise their children work rights and healthcare and all that kind of stuff. So that's really the perspective that we see in the work that we do at IARC.
And Delia, what can the sector do in terms of having an impact to affect that?
The family law court comes up an awful lot, and I get a lot of letters from people that have lost their children, and it's quite scary and frightening, and we need to follow it up at a minister's level. Some of the work we're doing at the moment is trying to work really closely with the Attorney General on a trauma-informed justice response, and again making sure that we think about magistrates and judges and how they're trained and how they respond and how they're recruited again. So there's a lot of stuff around the training piece and ensuring the judiciary really understand the dynamics of domestic and family violence, and looking at court infrastructures, safe rooms. We know that certainly in regional New South Wales, there's not enough access to those safe rooms, and some of those courts aren't as safe as they should be. So yeah, the family court system, the family law system is an issue, and it comes up a lot. And I think, Tali, you might want to add to this as well, because I know we've been, but it's something that we really do need some focus on, because like I said, there's some horrific stories out there, and it does worry us an awful lot, the disconnect.
Tali?
Yeah, I think I agree with everything that's been said, and I even think that some of what Jessica said could actually work across the board as well. I think the difficulty with the family law court is it's set up, and this sounds terrible, by men for men, because it's really a patriarchal system. It doesn't understand the dynamic of coercive control. So what ends up happening is the perpetrators are using the court systems to basically coerce the children, coerce the female into giving up their children. And this is part of what happens in the court all the time. And so the perpetrators will take even their partners to a doctor and coerce the doctor and tell them these are all the symptoms that this person has. They're going crazy. They can't possibly look after the children. But the behaviour they've experienced for the years that have gone on before is what has made them so distressed at the point that they're in the doctor's office. And so I think what happens is they take all this practiced use of coercion and they bring it into the family court system. It is then used against the woman. It's again used against judges, and often because there's this attitude of we make sure that the child stays with both parents, we miss that we're actually endangering the child's life, and we miss who's the real perpetrator in the situation. And often a lot of the history is not allowed in the courtroom at the time. So the woman is trying to defend herself quite often, which I know we're addressing. I don't know if we've actually addressed it, but I think it's such a difficult problem, and it really needs, like we're talking about, that trauma-informed training, that understanding of each particular situation, which we often call person-centered. It's making sure that we actually are looking at the individual situation, looking at the pattern of behaviour that's going on, that will then really show what is happening in that situation. And I think we keep endangering children by giving them to perpetrators, and that is something that just has to be addressed straight away anyway.
We've got a question coming in from Sienna. What practical actions can community members take to support the call for system change? And, practical actions is always something any of us want, isn't it? In terms of being able to, social media can be a disaster, no doubt, but sometimes just constantly reminding people, I know I do it through my ambassadorship with Our Watch, that there are programs happening, this stuff is happening, that women should be believed, that there is a problem. No one's making this stuff up. It's there. It's accounted. There's books. There's incredible stories, documentaries. The stuff's there. But I think again we feel very. We forget how powerful we are just as one voice, but we do feel quite unempowered or disempowered anyway. Delia, what kind of action can we take? Can someone take? What practical action can someone do? Because sometimes you feel like writing letters and writing emails falls on deaf ears, and I worry that incredible energy we had at that Women's March, where women were saying, and men, people who were there that day, saying, we've had enough of what's going on in this Parliament House behind us, as an example to the country, a terrible example, and not dealing with it. And as much as also the summit didn't put through so many of the recommendations, let's find some suggestions of practical actions that could make us feel like we've got something we can do.
Sure. And weren't we lucky when the Prime Minister said that, you know, that women weren't shot like they would have been in other countries for standing up and speaking freely? Gosh, when I saw that, I nearly thought, oh my goodness me, freedom of speech.
I guess too, with that, you know, on the day, people kept saying, I wish we had a Jacinda Ardern in charge. And I was trying to say, I actually said, you know, she's got a job. She's running her own country. We have a Jacinda here, where there are many Jacindas here that could do the job tomorrow, but we've got to get them there. And we've also got to make Parliament House safe for those women to work in. So if Parliament House isn't safest for a woman to work, no wonder we're having this discussion now. So practical actions. What can we do in the now?
Indeed. And Shenna, thank you for the question. I'm sure you've got plenty of answers. I used to work with Shenna, who's an incredible advocate in this space. I mean, the first thing I'm going to say, which is a bit from the heart, I'm great to see your heart as well there, Shen, is we actually need to care. Like, I really sometimes struggle with, oh my gosh, we work in an echo chamber in my work. We all talk to each other. We all follow each other on social media. We're all having the same conversation. Get out of the echo chamber. So first of all, I need my networks that don't work in this space to care, but I also need to know how to engage them without isolating them. And that's an issue, because we can all get a bit passionate if we work in the space, and then we end up pushing people away. So one, we need to somehow get people to care. And two, we need to, if we know a lot about this issue, bring them into the tent carefully and have like easy conversations. I think people, if they want to do some practical things, I mean, start some conversations, get volunteering, like get the local community to start volunteering at domestic violence services. That would be amazing. And get fundraising for these organisations as well, and starting to promote some of their messages and their work. And I also think learning about the issue is really important. I often say that in a lot of speeches, that people are kind of like, we want to learn from what you've got to say, but I also think jump online, Google what's domestic violence, what are the types of domestic violence, what's 1-800-RESPECT, and how can I help someone who might disclose to me? And that's really important as well in terms of practical tips. What else was I going to mention? Yeah, I mean, call it out as well carefully. Like, I think we've probably all been at that dinner table where we felt uncomfortable. And like I said, just try and be patient in that conversation, because I've kind of been told, you know, I'm a massive soccer fan, by the way. So I've been told, you know, why would you pay, you know, women don't play as well and all these different things. And you sit at the dinner table and you kind of go, well, actually, we probably invested money into men playing football hundreds and hundreds of years ago. So they've already had that huge amount of money put into football. I only ever read about men playing football when I was a big Tottenham Hotspur fan. I didn't even know there was women playing football. And just trying to have these safe conversations with people, I think, is really important. So that bystander stuff, get online, get fundraising, go volunteer, and start having a conversation.
Jessica and Tylee doing a lot of nodding. I like to see
so
it.
True.
Would
be
you
that
add
person.
anything, Jessica? Yeah, be that. I mean, that's
be
the
that
thing,
person at the dinner table. Be that person to start that conversation.
I mean, you know, it's easier to, I can see that it's easier sometimes for a chatty box like me to get the conversation going. And sometimes it's harder for someone who finds it hard to speak up and say and can't speak. Also, the men might like to call it out as well at the dinner party, and not just always be up to the ladies around the room. Jessica, sorry I interrupted you. What did you?
No, 100%. And I think Delia touched on that as well. You do it in a safe way, but calling out sexism, racism when you see it, because those things are so connected. I mean, call your local rep, call your local representative, tell them what you think about the lack of funding for, women's issues, domestic and family violence. They're always up for a chat. And the more people that call, the more likely you are to persuade, I suppose. Eventually there's a tipping point, right? The more people that are having this kind of conversations, loud conversations, soft conversations, they all make a difference. You know, I think it's really important to recognize that the decisions, the policies and the laws that we have now, they're not inevitable. It doesn't have to be this way. Somewhere down the line, our community decided that, domestic and family violence is this level of important. It doesn't have to be that way. That's changeable, and we can change that, you know, and I know it sounds really silly, but it's one person at a time.
Yeah, I think so too. I'm a big believer in having one conversation. I mean, it's exhausting and it takes forever. But again, you know, I reflect on JobKeeper. I mean, many in my industry in the arts didn't get it. But to think that the government could all of a sudden do something as drastic as find money for JobKeeper, which was incredible, you wonder how you could maybe do things like that for important issues like this and go, this is a life and death situation. So why would you not do that? Why would you not make this a major issue to look at and really try and address it? And again, back to that summit, Delia, back to that summit, you know, the Women's Safety Summit, there were so many recommendations and they put through barely a handful. What's next with that safety summit? Or do we have to wait until the next government comes in? Look at me. Who knows what will happen?
Interestingly, I had a meeting with the New South Wales government today about that. We had a bit of a big debrief, and actually the New South Wales government did do quite a bit of heavy lifting prior to the summit because we were going a bit crazy in the sector about the lack of consultation. And it's gone a bit quiet at the federal government level, I should say. But I popped the opinion piece that we did in the chat box. We were a bit disappointed, and we don't usually as a peak body go too opinionated and hard and fast, but everyone was so disappointed about the summit. And believe it or not, you've heard us talk about housing and refuges and all kinds today. And I know Yvonne's so passionate about that space for the City of Sydney. It was left off the summit agenda. Housing was left off the agenda. So we had to have a pre-summit before the summit and just went wild on social media and wrote to every minister you can think of. And we've had letters back to say thanks. And this is now, you know, they put in the statement because there was a delegate statement after the summit that then housing got added to. So it's back on the table, but it wasn't on the agenda. We know that there's going to be a new national plan that will come out next year. And we're really pleased to hear that there will be a standalone Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander plan, which was called for at the summit. And there was some really good conversations, I believe, around, you know, children and young people, which again was quite good at the summit. So I was kind of in the 2 days, it was a long couple of days, everyone. And Talia, I know we were messaging throughout actually, up and down with a kind of like some really good panels and some really poor panels, some work needs to be done in the justice space. But I guess I'm kind of holding on to the fact that before the summit started, everyone did a heap of work with Monash University, who've been holding all these consultations and have to release a report in mid-October, and the government have to listen to that. So those 2 days felt a bit tokenistic and like a bit of a show, but a hell of a lot of work's been going on 6 months prior to that summit. That was like, I think the 7th and 8th of September. And they have to go through that work, put a plan in place that the sector isn't going to go wild about. And we have had a bit of back and forth with Anne Ruston's office to reassure us on some of the things that we've been nervous about, because another thing that we're worried about is that specialisation of domestic and family violence services won't be in the plan. And by that, I mean, there's a lot of massive big housing providers that can do really good bid writing and really cool tenders. They're really geared up, got the money. And it happened to me in my organisation back in the UK, where we've been working since 1976 and we lost 3 of our safe houses because our bid wasn't as good as someone in London that came in and ended up losing the funding, and we got it back. But it's dangerous because you want specialist organisations that are trauma informed, embedded in the community already, doing the work in their community. So specialisation is a really big thing for us, and we hope to see a really strong national plan that is funded properly. And I know there was a comment at the end of the summit by one of the ministers, if you think funding's all you need, you've got it wrong. And I think we all cringed a bit because, of course, that's not just the solution, but we do need to invest in this issue. Otherwise, we wouldn't have all the issues we're talking about today if we just had that little bit more funding. And it wasn't like piecemeal and like a drop in the ocean, like pouring a glass of water in a bath. This issue's huge. We've got a national emergency and we need to start speaking more about it. So I'm hopeful, Julia. I mean, it's gone a bit quiet, but we are chasing up through the New South Wales government and chasing federal government on a hopeful plan that will be released, I think, February, March. But let's face it, the deadlines always blow out.
Talia, what about you in terms of any practical suggestions or comment on Delia?
Yeah, I can add to both of those. I think with the summit, I think one of the the ones that worked, the sessions that worked, were the ones that they engaged with lived experience in. And they were very powerful, and they were very profound, and they were a very well-rounded discussion. So there was lots of things that were able to come out of those discussions that were, you know, complementary, and also some that were slightly different. And I think this is the problem. We try to approach all of this as one size fits all, and we can't. We have to have a person-centered approach. We have to have what works for some of this cohort, some of this cohort, some of this cohort. How do we catch the other groups of people? And I think when we start doing that and stop getting these blanket policies that actually injure people, we're going to get a much better approach. And that was one of the problems with the summit. We had the same kind of people saying the same kind of things. And they were, some of them just felt like they weren't even, like they were authentic and honest to themselves, but because there wasn't the broad discussion, we couldn't get that dynamic movement that needs to happen in this space. And I think that was my biggest disappointment from it. And I'm part of a collective that actually wrote to the government and said, come on, you need to include the voices of people who've had experience in this place. They bring an expertise that no one else can bring into this space. So we're still working with government to try and get that to happen, but it needs to happen in every form of government, because if you leave those voices out, you actually leave the truth out of how these policies interact with people. And I'm thinking when we were talking earlier about what can we do differently, like the dinner party is a great conversation, but not just the person speaking up, back up the people. So when there's this is okay, then everyone else says, I agree, rather than leaving the person all on their own. That's a really simple thing that you can do. Happened to me on a train when some guy decided to bully me for no reason. He wanted to assert his power, and I said, oh, do you want to sit here? That's fine, I moved my stuff. And then he started to become abusive. And then I said to him, mate, I moved my stuff, you're sitting there, there's no other conversation around this. And the rest of the carriage got up and said, we agree. She has been very polite. She's provided that. That's what we can do as a community. Like, how powerful is that? And when someone gets up and says, no more abuse, we go, no more abuse. When someone gets up and says, I've been assaulted, we go, not okay. Like, how powerful, we forget how powerful we are, I think. We think that the politicians are the only power. But like you were saying earlier, we vote, and let's start voting for the right people, not the private school people who have very polished ways of speaking and ways of framing things that coerce us into thinking that they're doing the right thing for us. Let's vote for the real people. Let's vote for the people who are on the ground. Let's vote for the people who are saying, hey, I actually care about you and I'm going to make a difference because I get what you're talking about, and what I don't get, I'm going to ask more and more people to help me. And I think governments that actually bring in more people to consult with are the most powerful, strong and engaging governments. And they're the ones that are going to but like, let's stop re-voting people that just don't know what they're doing, because this is the result. A massive increase in domestic and family violence, a massive increase in homelessness, a massive increase in deaths of people with disabilities. In the UK, 62% of the deaths over COVID are from people with disabilities. I'll leave it there.
No, thank you, Talia, absolutely. We're going to ask, I'm just going to get one more question from our group to wrap up, because we will be finishing in about 15 minutes.
Can I just say, Julia?
Please, Yvonne, please.
I just wanted to say, and it's key to what the speakers have said, is that we've created a normalisation of some of these behaviours. And, you know, like if you think about it, you know, in the 70s and 80s, if you were a married woman and you were, you know, sexually assaulted by your husband and you go to the police, they would say, but he's your husband. So we haven't really moved that far, you know, in terms of timeframes. It's the thinking that, and the normalisation, but also the ownership is just not there. So there are systems, and as Delia started saying earlier around, you know, the younger cadets that are coming through, and their mindset is so very different to what is lived. And people are often just focused around what they think exists, you know, like the extreme part of domestic violence. So, you know, what makes the media versus actually what is lived in our very homes. And so, you know, the terms around coercive control, you know, is in so many different aspects in everyday life that it's become normal. And yet we don't put the label on it, but it's the actual behaviour. Like, say, for example, I have seen terms being used as, you know, like in the Aboriginal community controlled sector around lateral violence, or you know, it's just lateral abuse. So, you know, actually, no, what it is, let's call it out. Don't give it a nice name. Let's call out what the actual behaviour is. And so, you know, we talk about, you know, some aspects of it and how there is a policing response to it, but then there is also a response where women don't feel comfortable to raise them, or when they do raise them, their mental health is being questioned because people are saying, oh, she's nanas because she's raised these very issues, and police actually referring to, you know, for people to be assessed for their mental health, rather than actually looking at it. This is a true safety issue, regardless of whether you're male or female. If there are issues being raised and they're so serious that they feel like they need to involve the police or anyone else for that matter, or even, you know, contact the helplines, the way that it's treated is not treated in its pure essence, you know, from the policing. And I think that's the part that we really need to be mindful of. And we also can normalise these behaviours because we don't actually want to address it. And that's the, you know, it's the train ride, you know, people standing up against these sort of behaviours, because if we actually hide from it in a public place or even in a group setting, what's actually taken place in a personal setting where it's one-on-one or a family.
Thank you, Yvonne. We've got a question from the Older Women Network. Of course, I'd like to ask the panel to comment on the invisibility of older women. Absolutely a problem, especially in homelessness. And also that there are 50 sexual assaults taking place in nursing homes every week. I mean, what are we doing to each other? Honestly, it's, yeah, you wonder where people's humanity has gone and responsibility in their own work and what they see and what they hear. Delia?
Great, and hello Yumi, because I'm thinking that's Yumi that's asked that question, and I want to just give a massive shout out to Yumi, who is an incredible advocate in the space, and we really admire her work and feel honoured to work alongside her at Domestic Violence New South Wales. We're releasing a report next week, funnily enough, around increasing women's economic independence and housing for Anti-Poverty Week, and the big key finding is women over 55 are such a high-risk cohort, and again the housing issue, and again the lack of superannuation and all these things that are impacting older women who have basically, you know, been exposed to the gender inequality and the lack of pay and everything else for so many years. So it's certainly a huge commitment for the peak, and obviously we work with organisations like the Older Women's Network to ensure that that advocacy is propelled and front and centre with the Attorney General and everyone else. And also, as Yumi's mentioned, we don't talk enough about the abuse that's going on in residential care settings, and that is a massive issue to be discussed, and certainly through carers and everything else. So yeah, I think more and more is coming up because of the advocacy of the Older Women's Network, and it's really important we're recognising that cohort and the impacts that they've faced. And quick thing Yvonne mentioned about the 70s, and this is something, again, these entrenched views. I'm reading a book, well, I've read it now, it's called Australia Before the Avocado or something like that, or Before Avocado Came. Anyway, it's all about Women's Weekly, and it talks about, it shows you Women's Weekly adverts in the 70s, and it's got like a woman walking along the street, and it says, do you want to look like the woman that your husband's staring at on the street? Take Ford diet pills. Now think about those messages that have been going on and on for so many years and the impacts that's had, you know. So it's the gender inequity, the patriarchy, the media, the messaging, and the impacts of superannuation, lack of housing pathways, all these things that have come so many years later. And we really need to be thinking about that cohort hugely. And yes, like I think Yumi's mentioned about disability as well. And Tali, that article that you were featured in yesterday, I might pop in the chat box. That was such a good one around disability. Thank you.
A question from Kerry. We're hearing there's an increase of 16 to 25-year-old men during lockdown perpetrating. Practically for generational change, we need stronger education programs in schools, and certainly, you know, you sort of really want to get them when they're young and just so impressionable. The question continues, are we expecting any educational syllabus changes in New South Wales? Anybody know?
I can add something into that. There are talks about syllabus changes, and they are trying to do some things. I'm part of a program called Love Bites, which goes into schools and educates on healthy relationships, on what is sexual assault, what is domestic and family violence, what do you do if you're a bystander? And those kind of programs are absolutely crucial. And the thing I'm finding quite distressing at the moment is during COVID, I'm hearing more and more young people asking me, what do I do? I need to leave my boyfriend. He's a perpetrator. And I'm thinking we had moved so far, and then COVID happened, and I went, young women are still getting the wrong message that we are not good enough. We are good enough. Young women are amazing, and they're the future of this country as well as the young men. And we're missing what they can contribute, and they are not getting the message that they do not need to accept unacceptable behaviour, because we keep minimizing the behaviour, we keep reframing coercion, and we keep saying, oh no, he didn't mean it, he's not a bad guy. We still have the rhetoric of the nice guy, even though we're moving past it. So I think when we go into schools and we do these programs, it's vitally important, because we not only can help people pick violence when it's happening to someone else, but when it's happening to them, when it's happening to their family, when they're experiencing domestic and family violence themselves. And I think we haven't quite talked about young people, like children in domestic and family violence, but they're crucial. We have been treating them as an adjunct or an animal in some way, not a human being. Like, we've just changed it. So animals are seen as being part of domestic and family violence. Children are victims of domestic and family violence directly by watching it or seeing it happen, directly by having it done to them. They're being sexually attacked as well by family members in their own families. So we need to think about this seriously, and we need to change the laws also around children so that they can have the same safety that adult victims are having, and they can have financial abuse recompense. They can have all sorts of the same things put in place for them. So yes, education in schools, acknowledge children, and start working to bring all of that together, because the young people are our future, and they are truly amazing, these generations.
And thank you, Yvonne, too. You've been posting in the chat box any numbers that you might need if you're feeling like you'd like to talk to someone. The Family and Domestic Violence Support Services, 1800 Respect, Women's Crisis Line, Men's Referral Service, Men's Line, Lifeline, and Relationships Australia as well. It's a huge topic. It's such a huge topic, and again, it seems to me to come down to women being believed and needing that kind of support. As a last word from everyone, what would you like to leave us with in terms of, you know, again, an action that can be taken? I always think a call to action is a really good one, and maybe I'll start with you, Jessica.
Thanks, Julia. Look, I would like to see all women, regardless of status, regardless of their circumstances, be able to access safety, support services, to be able to leave an abusive relationship. And by leave an abusive relationship, I don't mean they need to leave the house. I just mean literally no longer feel like their life or their well-being or their children's is at risk. That's what I'd like to see. And I think we have some deep inequalities in the access to services depending on, you know, a woman's circumstances, migrant women, cold women, women on temporary visas, of course, is my area of expertise, but we all know Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island women with disabilities and the LGBTIQA community all also face serious difficulties in accessing services. So I'd like to see more of an equal, I suppose, playing field for women who want to access safety and services. And how we do that, I've got a million different ways that we can do that, but that's what I would like to see.
Talia?
I think we believe that safety is important, so we'll spend billions of dollars on submarines. So let's actually show that safety is important and put that towards women, children and other victims. Let's ensure housing is supported for them, that there is a person-centred approach, that people can feel empowered and cared for in the way that they do it. Keep specialist services, because that's the only way we're going to move forward. We cannot do this generalised thing. It doesn't work because they won't understand trauma. Keep training in trauma-informed training and make sure we hold everyone accountable, because everyone can do it together.
Thank you. And Delia?
Well, I'm going to personally keep banging the drum, and I want to thank everyone.
In a way, Delia, you can't not. It's your job.
Totally.
Yes.
Oh yeah. But I also want to personally thank everyone who's been direct messaging me in the chat box, because I actually think I've seen so much passion and great questions today, and obviously I think that's really important. Keep those questions coming in to the peak. Keep asking, because a lot of the times, like I said, we sit in an echo chamber. I do think it is worth writing, if you're a community member, to your local members. I do think that is really important. I do think jumping on social media and spreading the word, or seeing a really great article that your friends might not have even thought about, it might be domestic violence related, pop it on social media. And a solution I want to see, certainly in the city of Sydney, is a commitment to social housing that's safe and affordable, and that obviously there's access pathways to people at any level, like Jessica said, who needs help gets help. It's not just like we need refuges. We also need to keep people safe in their home, but we need those safe housing pathways. Thank you.
And Yvonne?
Oh, look, I'm actually just really warmed in the heart and soul, really, that we've got so many here today that are either asking the questions or providing answers. Each and every one of us, if we're not informed, resource yourself in a way. It may not be for yourself, or at the time you may not think it, male and female. You may think that this issue will not impact you. It may impact a loved one or a friend. You have the opportunity to provide some information that can help the lives of others and or yourself. And I think that we all, as a community here today, have the opportunity to make a difference and make that positive change, that we can change the cycle of what should not be accepted in our lifetime. And if we don't do it, we don't want it to continue. And I think we owe it to our future generations, our children, our grandchildren, to make sure that it does not become a normal way of life. It is not, it should not be. And making sure that you use your voice well, whether that be at the polling booth in December, or whether that actually be beyond today, just that we make sure that we create a society, a community, but our own friendship and our circles, a safer one for each and every one of us. So thank you for your time.
Thank you. And I know that I've been doing a lot of work in this, in the election space, because I feel like we've got 5 to 6 months, and I'm just encouraging people to read a bit more about what's out there and who's available that you could vote in, that might make some choices for you. We do have a choice as a voter, a very big voice. It's compulsory in this country. So, I want to spend the next 6 months just making sure people have studied for the exam when they go in to vote, and feel like they can be confident. Like whatever you vote, you can go in and go, I did the study. I know what they stand for. I think I know where I'd like to go with. Then you can enjoy the voting. I think people hate voting because they actually haven't done any study. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I hope it was a little bit of help which is in such a big issue. And thank you to Karen and also to Miad for helping us today in the technological sphere, because I mean, I'm 54, I still struggle on Zoom, I won't lie to you. I hope you can all have a bit of a rest this afternoon. It is a Friday after all, and wherever you might be in, because I think some people might be tuning in who might not be in New South Wales. I hope you're doing okay. And New South Wales, well, go well with that freedom. Just take it easy. All right. See you. Mwah.
Thanks, everyone.